You know this feeling. You lie awake at night, replaying the same thought over and over again like a broken record you can't switch off. What if you fail? What if they judge you? What if you made the wrong choice? The mind begins to spiral, not once, not twice, but endlessly, until it feels like you are locked in a prison built by your own thoughts. Overthinking is not just a habit. It is a slow poison. It steals your sleep, robs your energy, and turns small problems into looming monsters that never existed in the first place. Yet here's the hidden truth. The Stoics already faced this centuries ago. They knew that the real chains are not out there in the world, but inside your imagination. The Stoics were not philosophers who sat comfortably in libraries. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire while battling plagues and invasions. Epictetus was a slave who knew real suffering before he ever spoke of freedom. Seneca advised emperors while wrestling with his own mortality. And what did all three discover? That the mind left unchecked becomes its own worst enemy. Overthinking is the clearest proof of that. You take one seed of doubt and you water it until it grows into a forest of fear. But imagine if you could interrupt that cycle. Imagine if, instead of being trapped in endless speculation, you learn to anchor yourself in clarity, in presence, in the steady calm of reason. That is exactly what the Stoics teach you to do, and modern psychology, with its studies on anxiety and trauma, echoes the same wisdom. Together they form a map, a way out of the prison of your thoughts and into a state of freedom, strength, and peace. Over the next steps, you will learn how. Part 1: The Trap of Overthinking. Picture this: you receive an email from your boss late at night. It's short, vague, and to the point. We need to talk tomorrow, nothing more. You close your laptop, but your mind doesn't close with it. Instead, it begins spinning. You imagine every possible scenario. Maybe you forgot something important. Maybe they are disappointed. Maybe you're on the verge of being fired. By the time you finally fall asleep, you've rehearsed 10 different outcomes, none of which actually happen the next day. When the meeting comes, it turns out to be about a minor scheduling change. Your boss hadn't given the email a second thought, yet you had given it hours of worry, stress, and fear. This is the trap of overthinking. It is not the reality itself that torments you, but the endless echo of your imagination. The Stoics saw this clearly. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, wrote in his journal, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." Overthinking is what happens when you surrender that power. You allow your mind to run untamed, inventing stories, drawing catastrophes in the air, and exhausting you with problems that rarely ever come to pass. Modern psychology has another word for this cycle: rumination. It's the tendency of the brain, especially under stress, to loop back on a thought again and again without resolution. Psychologists have found that rumination not only fuels anxiety, but also deepens depression. When you ruminate, you amplify your fears instead of dissolving them. It is like scratching a wound in hopes that it will heal faster, but instead you only make it worse. The Stoics understood this centuries before science gave it a name. Seneca warned that we are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality. Overthinking is your imagination turned against you, and it is powerful enough to make you suffer in ways reality never would. Consider how this plays out in everyday life. You hesitate before sending a message because you think, what if they misunderstand? You avoid speaking up in a meeting because you think, what if I sound stupid? You delay a project because you imagine every possible flaw before you even begin. The energy that could have been used for action, for progress, gets wasted in rehearsing 1,000 failures that never happen. It is like paying interest on a debt you never owed. Think of a time you worried endlessly about something small, a forgotten text, an awkward silence, a minor mistake, and later discovered the other person hadn't even noticed. Your overthinking cost you peace but accomplished nothing. The Stoics would call this a waste of your psyche as energy. In their eyes, the mind is like a garden. You can water it with thoughts that nourish growth or with weeds that suffocate it. Overthinking is nothing but weeds. A striking modern example comes from the world of sports. Take the case of a basketball player standing at the free throw line in the final seconds of a game. If he begins to overthink, calculating angles, replaying misses, imagining headlines, his body tenses, his rhythm breaks, and he is far more likely to miss. But if he trusts the training already within him, focuses on the present motion, and acts, his chance of success rises dramatically. Overthinking in this way is not only useless, it is destructive. The lesson here is sobering but freeing. Most of what you fear will never come to pass. Studies suggest that nearly 90% of the things people worry about either don't happen or are far less severe than imagined, which means that most of your mental suffering is self-inflicted. The Stoics invite you to notice this trap, to become aware that the endless loop of what if is not reality. It's imagination masquerading as reality. So what do you do when you catch yourself spiraling into the cycle of overthinking? The first step is simply awareness. Recognize the pattern. Say to yourself, this is not reality. This is my mind spinning stories. That pause alone can break the loop. You can then gently redirect your energy toward clarity instead of chaos. And here lies the beginning of the cure. When you realize that the mind can be trained just as the body can be trained, you stop being at the mercy of your fears. Overthinking thrives in the shadows of unconsciousness, but once you shine the light of awareness on it, its power begins to fade. This is the first lesson the Stoics give you. Don't confuse imagination with reality. See overthinking for what it is, a mental trap. And once you see the trap clearly, you are already halfway free from it. Part 2, Dichotomy of Control, the anchor against mental storms. Now that you've seen how overthinking traps you in imagination, the question becomes, how do you escape it? The Stoics offered a principle so simple and yet so powerful that it has outlived empires. Epictetus said it plainly, some things are up to us and some are not. This is the dichotomy of control. At its core, it teaches you to separate what belongs to your influence from what does not, and to place your energy only where it truly matters. Think about how much of your overthinking comes from trying to control what you never could. You worry about what others think of you, about how a decision will play out, about outcomes that belong to the future. You torment yourself over the weather on your wedding day, or the reaction of an audience during a presentation, or the way a stranger looked at you on the street. None of these things rest in your hands. Yet your mind burns itself out trying to grip them. When you practice the Stoic dichotomy of control, you learn to anchor yourself in the storm. Imagine being a ship caught in heavy waves. If you drop your anchor into what is firm and solid, you remain steady. If you throw it into the waves themselves, you are tossed endlessly. The mind does the same. When you anchor your attention on what is outside your control, you are swept away in the storm of overthinking. But when you anchor it on what is within your actions, your choices, your responses, you find stability even when the storm rages around you. Modern psychology echoes this principle in the concept of locus of control. Research shows that people who develop an internal locus of control, focusing on what they can directly influence, experience less anxiety and greater resilience. Those with an external locus of control, obsessing over forces outside their reach, are far more likely to suffer stress, helplessness, and yes, overthinking. The Stoics understood this 2,000 years ago. Clarity begins when you sort the controllable from the uncontrollable. Consider a real-world example from the world of sports. A professional tennis player, haunted by thoughts of winning and losing, can easily crumble under the weight of overthinking. Every mistake feels fatal, every point becomes a mental burden. But when she shifts her focus away from the final score and onto what is within her control, the swing of the racket, the footwork, the effort she gives in each moment, her mind clears. She finds freedom not by guaranteeing victory, but by anchoring herself in what belongs to her. And ironically, this freedom often makes winning more likely. The same applies to you. Think of a moment when you replayed a conversation in your head, analyzing what the other person might have thought. Their judgment is not within your control, but your clarity in expressing yourself is. Or perhaps you lie awake worrying about the outcome of a job interview. The final decision rests in their hands, but your preparation, your demeanor, your honesty, all of that belongs entirely to you. By pouring your energy into what is yours, you reclaim power. By trying to control what is not, you hand your power away. Here's a practical exercise the Stoics would approve of. The next time you find yourself overthinking, take a sheet of paper and draw 2 columns. At the top of one column, write "within my control." At the top of the other, "not in my control." Then take the problem that's been spiraling in your mind and divide it honestly. Place every action you can take, every choice that belongs to you on the left. Place the opinions of others, the twists of fate, the outcomes of chance on the right. Look at the list. Feel the relief that comes when you see clearly where your responsibility ends. This practice doesn't just quiet your mind, it strengthens your character. Because when you stop wasting energy on what isn't yours, you can fully give yourself to what is. And this is the paradox the Stoics understood. By releasing control of outcomes, you gain more influence over your life. By letting go of the waves, you hold the anchor. So when you feel the poison of overthinking creeping in, ask the Stoics question: is this mine to carry or not? The answer may not always be easy, but it is always clear. And with clarity comes peace. Part 3: Action over rumination. You've now seen how overthinking thrives when you confuse imagination with reality, and how the dichotomy of control can anchor you against the storm. But there is another truth the Stoics pressed again and again: thought without action is paralysis. Seneca put it sharply: it is not that we think too little, but that we think too much without acting. The mind, when left idle, multiplies its doubts. Action, however small, is the antidote. Think about how often you delay because of imagined scenarios. You want to apply for a job, but you spend days analyzing whether your resume is strong enough, whether the employer will reject you, whether the interview will go badly. You want to call someone you care about, but you rehearse every possible awkward turn the conversation might take. You want to start a new project, but you convince yourself you need more research, more preparation, more time. Each moment of hesitation feeds the loop of rumination, and in the meantime, nothing happens. The Stoics understood that momentum itself heals the mind. Epictetus told his students, don't explain your philosophy, embody it. To embody is to move, to put into practice what you know instead of endlessly thinking about it. Action breaks the cycle because it returns you from speculation into reality, while overthinking projects fear into the future. Action roots you in the present, where you can do something real. Modern psychology confirms this. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most effective treatments for anxiety, often emphasizes what's called behavioral activation. Instead of sitting in thought loops, patients are encouraged to take small, concrete steps, making a call, writing a page, going for a walk. Even minor action interrupts the spiral of rumination and builds a sense of agency. The mind quiets down when the body moves forward. Consider the example of Thomas Edison. He did not wait until he was certain of success before acting. He tested thousands of variations of the light bulb before discovering the one that worked. Each failure was not a moment of self-doubt, but a step forward. If Edison had sat paralyzed by questions, what if I fail? What if I waste my time? What if the world rejects me? The modern world might still be lit by candles. His genius was not only in invention, but in refusing to drown in thought when action was possible. But this lesson is not just for inventors or entrepreneurs. Think of the countless ordinary moments where action can free you. You are nervous about meeting new people, so you stand in the corner and overthink. Or you could simply walk up, introduce yourself, and let the interaction unfold. You hesitate to send an email, worried it might not be perfect. Or you could click send and free your mind from the loop. Action doesn't promise perfection, but it guarantees progress. And progress is what quiets the poison of overthinking. Here's a practice you can try. The next time you feel caught in the whirlpool of rumination, reduce the problem to the smallest possible action you can take right now. If you're stuck on whether to apply for a job, just open the application form and fill in the first field. If you're overthinking a conversation, write down one sentence you could say and let that be enough to begin. Each small action is like a hammer strike against the walls of the prison your mind has built. The first swing may not break through, but with persistence, the walls collapse. Remember, the Stoics were not philosophers of endless theory, they were men of action. Marcus Aurelius led an empire through war and plague, yet still found time each day to reflect, to write, to improve himself, not by sitting endlessly in doubt, but by acting on his principles. If an emperor under relentless pressure could ground himself in decisive action, so can you. So when your mind begins to spiral with questions, stop asking what if. Instead, ask what can I do right now, and then do it. Because while thought fuels overthinking, action cuts through it like a blade. The cure for rumination is not more analysis, it is movement, and each step forward brings you closer to freedom. Part 4, Reframing the worst-case scenario. Even when you remind yourself of what is in your control, even when you act instead of ruminate, there's still a voice inside that whispers, but what if the worst happens? This is the deepest root of overthinking, the fear of disaster. You imagine the collapse of your plans, the loss of your security, the humiliation of failure. And so the mind circles endlessly, trying to predict, prevent, or escape what it dreads most. But the Stoics had a brilliant technique for this. They called it premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Instead of running from the worst-case scenario, they faced it head-on. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Do not be disturbed by the picture of your imagination, but take the thing itself and see what it is." The practice is simple but powerful. When you are paralyzed by anxiety, instead of letting vague fear dominate you, you imagine the worst possible outcome in concrete detail. You ask yourself, if this truly happened, what would it look like? And more importantly, would I survive it? Could I adapt, recover, continue? Take a modern example. Imagine someone consumed by the thought of losing their job. Every night they replay it in their head. The conversation with the boss, the empty desk, the judgment of friends and family. But when they finally sit down and practice premeditatio malorum, they paint the full picture. They imagine the layoff, the financial strain, the awkward conversations. And then they ask, would life end here? No, they could cut expenses, take temporary work, lean on friends, search for new opportunities. The fear shrinks when it's brought out into the open. What once felt unbearable becomes survivable. Modern psychology supports this. Therapists often use a technique called exposure. Instead of avoiding fear, you bring it to the surface in a safe way. The brain learns that even if the feared scenario occurred, it would not be the end. Anxiety decreases because uncertainty decreases. It's the ambiguity, the shadow, that fuels overthinking. Once you shine a light on it, the monster loses its size. Seneca himself practiced this regularly. He would spend days living as if he had lost everything, dressing simply, eating the bare minimum, and reminding himself, is this what I feared? By rehearsing poverty, he broke its hold over him. He discovered that even in the worst case, life continued and dignity could remain intact. This is not pessimism, it is preparation. It is the discovery that you can endure far more than your anxious mind believes. You can try this yourself. The next time a fear loops endlessly in your thoughts, stop and write it down. Ask, what is the absolute worst that could happen? Write it vividly without holding back. Then beneath it, write the ways you could respond. What resources would you draw upon? Who could you turn to for help? What skills could you use to adapt? As you do this, you may notice a shift. The vague dread becomes a concrete plan. Fear loses its poison. There's another gift in this practice. It frees you to live with courage, because when you know you can survive the worst, you are no longer paralyzed by the fear of it. Think of explorers, entrepreneurs, artists, lighters, the ones who dared to step into the unknown. What gave them courage was not the certainty of success, but the confidence that even failure would not destroy them. Nelson Mandela, for example, endured 27 years in prison, facing the worst case of being silenced and forgotten. Yet he emerged with his spirit unbroken, ready to lead his country. He showed the Stoic truth. Resilience is not about avoiding hardship, but about knowing you can outlast it. So when your mind whispers, "What if it all goes wrong?" don't answer with silence or escape. Answer by saying, "Then I will face it and I will endure." Reframe the worst-case scenario not as a threat, but as a test, and once you've seen that even the worst cannot unmake you, the endless loops of overthinking begin to dissolve. What remains is not fear, but freedom. Part 5, Presence as the Antidote. Even after you've recognized the trap of overthinking, practiced the dichotomy of control, taken action, and faced the worst-case scenario, there remains one final ingredient the Stoics insisted upon: presence. Because overthinking at its core is a form of time travel. You fling yourself into the past, replaying regrets and mistakes, or you hurl yourself into the future, rehearsing fears and fantasies. Either way, you abandon the one place where life is actually lived, the present moment. Marcus Aurelius gave this counsel to himself as emperor: confine yourself to the present. He knew that his power, his clarity, and his peace depended not on what had already happened or what might one day occur, but on what was before him right now. The present moment in Stoic thought is like a solid ground beneath your feet. The past is unchangeable, the future unknowable. Only the present can be acted upon, lived, and shaped. Modern psychology mirrors this wisdom in what we call mindfulness. Decades of research show that training yourself to return to the present reduces anxiety, lowers stress, and increases well-being. When your attention is here, on your breath, on your body, on the reality before you, the endless cycle of overthinking loosens its grip. Because overthinking cannot survive in the present, it needs either the past or the future to feed on. Think of how this plays out in ordinary life. A father sits on the floor with his child, toys scattered around, laughter filling the room. But in his mind he is elsewhere, worrying about a deadline, replaying a difficult meeting, anticipating tomorrow's challenges. Physically he is present, mentally he is gone, and so he misses the moment that will never return. Overthinking robs him not only of peace but of presence, of life itself. The Stoic practice calls him back. Be here now. You can practice this too. The next time your mind begins to spiral, bring your attention to something simple and immediate: the feeling of your breath moving in and out, the sensation of your feet on the ground, the sound of the world around you. Ask yourself, what is happening right here, right now? Often you'll find that in this exact moment. There is no catastrophe, there is no judgment, no failure, no disaster. There is only you, breathing, alive, capable. The storm exists only in the imagination. One powerful example of this comes from Eckhart Tolle, whose teachings on presence have influenced millions. At his lowest point, overwhelmed by depression and self-loathing, he had a moment of realization: I cannot live with myself any longer. And suddenly he saw there were two voices, the self that suffered and the awareness that noticed. In that instant, his overthinking dissolved. What replaced it was presence, the simple act of being aware of this moment without judgment. Though not a Stoic himself, Toll's insight echoes Marcus and Epictetus. Freedom comes when you withdraw from the false dramas of time and return to the reality of now. For you, presence does not require years of meditation or retreat. It begins with small acts. When you eat, taste the food instead of scrolling your phone. When you walk, feel each step instead of drowning in thought. When you work, give yourself fully to the task instead of splitting your mind with imagined outcomes. Presence is not about emptying your mind of all thought. It is about anchoring your mind to what is happening instead of letting it drift into illusions. The Stoics would say, life is always happening now, and if you can be present here, you cannot be lost in overthinking. This is why presence is the final antidote, because even when fears return, when doubts whisper, when the mind tempts you with its endless loops, you always have this choice to step out of imagination and into the clarity of the present. And here, in this moment, you are free. Stoic method for overthinking. By now, you can see that overthinking is not just a bad habit. It is a pattern that drains your energy, robs you of presence, and magnifies fears that rarely exist outside your imagination. But the Stoics did not leave us with philosophy alone. They gave us a practical framework, a method for living with clarity. If we gather the lessons we've walked through, you find 4 timeless steps that together form a cure for the poison of overthinking. The first step is recognition. You must notice when you've fallen into the trap. This is the moment you catch yourself replaying an email in your mind, rehearsing a conversation for the 10th time, or spinning what-if scenarios late into the night. Seneca warned that most of our suffering is imagined, not real. The act of recognizing that what you are experiencing is not reality, but imagination, is the first strike of freedom. Awareness shines light on the trap, and in that light, its power begins to weaken. The second step is separation, the dichotomy of control. Once you've recognized the loop, ask the Stoics question: what is within my control here and what is not? Epictetus made this the cornerstone of his teaching. Your choices, your actions, your words, those are yours. The reactions of others, the twists of fortune, the outcomes of chance, those belong to fate. Overthinking thrives when you try to grip what was never yours. But when you redirect your energy to what is yours, the mind steadies, like a ship dropping anchor into solid ground. The third step is action. Seneca reminded us that it is not that we think too little, but that we think too much without acting. Once you know what belongs to you, do it. Send the email, make the call, step forward even if imperfectly. Psychology calls this behavioral activation. Stoicism calls it living according to reason. Either way, the truth holds. Action breaks the paralysis of rumination. Each small step you take is a blow against the walls of the prison your mind has built. The fourth step is reframing. Marcus Aurelius urged himself not to be disturbed by the picture of imagination, but to see the thing itself. The Stoic practice of premeditatio malorum teaches you to imagine the worst-case scenario, not to feed fear but to dissolve it. When you picture the worst clearly, you discover that it is survivable, you could adapt, you could endure, and with that knowledge, fear shrinks back into its proper size. This reframing also extends into presence. Marcus wrote, "Confine yourself to the present." Once you face the worst, you return to what is happening now, where life is lived. The future does not need you yet. The past no longer owns you. Only this moment is real, and in this moment, overthinking has no home. Put together, these 4 steps form the Stoic method for overthinking. Recognize the trap, separate what you can and cannot control, act where you can. And reframe both fear and time. Imagine applying this across the ordinary struggles of life. The late night worry about a forgotten email. You recognize the loop, remind yourself you cannot control another's thoughts, send a brief message of clarity and move on. The anxiety about your career. You separate your effort from the outcome, take small daily actions, face the possibility of setback, and ground yourself in today's work. The dread of the future. You imagine the worst. Realize it would not destroy you, and then return to the simple breath in your lungs, the ground beneath your feet, the life in front of you. This is what the Stoics offer, not an escape from thought, but a way to guide it. Not the promise of never feeling fear, but the power to stop being ruled by it. Overthinking is noise. Stoicism is clarity. And with these 4 steps, you hold the tools to turn noise into stillness, poison into strength. The cure was always within you. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Seneca. As you close this reflection, pause and notice how much of your life has been consumed by battles that never actually happened. Think of the arguments you rehearsed but never spoke, the disasters you imagined but never came, the judgments you feared but never arrived. This is the poison of overthinking. It pulls you out of the present, out of your strength, and locks you in a prison built by your own mind. The Stoics do not promise you an easy life. They do not promise that pain, betrayal, or loss will vanish. But they do promise something far more powerful, that your mind can be trained to meet whatever comes with steadiness. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations not for the world but for himself, as daily reminders to return to clarity when his own thoughts became tangled. Seneca wrote his letters not to appear wise, but to keep his soul anchored in turbulent times. Epictetus taught his students not how to avoid suffering, but how to distinguish between what can be controlled and what must be endured. And you, sitting here listening, reflecting, are part of that same lineage. You have the same capacity they did. You can choose not to be poisoned by your thoughts. You can choose to create space between fear and action. You can choose to live with a quiet, unshakable mind. So let this be your experiment. The next time your mind begins to spiral, ask yourself, is this thought helping me or harming me? Is this within my control or is it not? And then gently but firmly bring yourself back to what is real, what is present, what is yours. Practice this enough and you will discover that you are no longer captive to your overthinking, you are master of it. If this reflection has spoken to you, take a moment to share it in the comments. Tell me how overthinking shows up in your life and how you're choosing to meet it with Stoic clarity. And if you want to continue walking this path, learning how philosophy can heal the wounds of modern life, make sure to subscribe. Because together we are building something rare in this noisy world, unshakable calm.